Adeline Brennan stood on a splintered auction platform, with a banker's hand gripping her elbow, while men who had never known her name stared as if loneliness made a woman property. She had come west as a mail-order bride, carrying one carpet bag, one faded photograph, and a promise that someone in Mercy Crossing wanted her. Instead, the man was gone. The preacher looked away, and the banker announced her unpaid passage like a debt nailed to her skin. Adeline did not speak. Shame had locked her voice behind her teeth. Then Lawrence Hollis, the cold cowboy Marshal with dust on his coat and grief in his eyes, stepped through the crowd and laid one hand on his revolver. Before we ride into story, let me know what country you are watching from. Comment your country below, and subscribe if you love emotional cowboy stories about shame, rescue, forgiveness, and second chances. The train left Adeline Brennan standing beneath a gray morning sky, with coal smoke in her hair and prairie dust already clinging to the hem of her travel dress. Mercy Crossing was smaller than the advertisement had promised. It was not a thriving cattle town with bright windows and honest opportunity. It was a hard strip of buildings along a rutted street, with a church bell that sounded tired, a jail with one small window, and a bank built of red brick as if it meant to outlast every poor soul who owed it money. Adeline held a letter in her gloved hand. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had turned white. It was from Daniel Whitcomb, the man who had written to her for 5 months, calling her brave, calling her kind, calling her the answer to his prayers. He had paid for half her passage, promised to pay the rest when she arrived, and written that Mercy Crossing needed a schoolteacher's patience and a wife's heart. But no one waited at the platform. She stood there, while the other passengers were kissed, gathered, claimed, or carried away. The station agent swept tobacco ash from the boards and would not meet her eyes. A boy with freckles stared at the ribbon around her throat until his mother pulled him away. The wind moved over the flat country and made her skirt tremble against her ankles. At last, a man in a dark suit crossed from the bankside of the street. He was not old, but he wore age like a weapon, with silvered hair, tight lips, and eyes that counted everything before they felt anything. "Adeline Brennan?" he asked. She nodded. "I am Silas Pritt, president of the Mercy Crossing Bank." He held out his hand, not to greet her, but to receive the letter. "You were expected." Her fingers closed around the paper. For a moment, she could not let go of it. The letter was the last proof that she had not imagined kindness. Mr. Pritt's smile thinned. "Miss Brennan, Daniel Whitcomb is dead." The world went quiet, except for the iron sigh of the cooling train. Adeline's lips parted, but no sound came. Her voice had failed her before, in a narrow boarding house room back east where shouting had turned to threats and promises had turned to bruises. Since then, words had become stones in her throat. She could write them, think them, pray them, but when fear entered the room, she could not push them into the air. Pritt watched her silence and mistook it for weakness. "Weaver took him 3 weeks ago. I sent word, but perhaps it did not reach you. Unfortunately, your travel agreement remains unsettled. Your passage, room fees, agency commission, and Daniel's advance were all secured against his pending household account." Adeline shook her head once. She opened her carpet bag with shaking hands and drew out a small slate she carried for necessity. On it, she wrote, "I can work." Pritt read it, then smiled in a way that made her wish she had not shown him her handwriting. "Work, yes. That is precisely the matter. Daniel's property was pledged to the bank. His cabin, horse, and tools will be sold. As for you, the marriage contract gives certain rights of placement." She did not understand until noon. By then, half the town had gathered near the livery yard. A crate had been dragged beneath the hanging sign. Pritt stood beside it with a ledger under one arm and a clerk behind him, holding papers. He spoke of debt, of lawful transfer, of a woman stranded without kin. He never called it selling a bride. He called it recovering expenses. He called it placing her in a respectable household. He called it charity dressed in order. But the men in the crowd knew what it was. Some came out of curiosity. Some came with pity and did nothing with it. Some smiled. Women watched from store porches with hands tucked beneath aprons, whispering that a decent woman should not have traveled alone so far. Someone said mail-order brides knew the risk. Someone else said silence was suspicious. Adeline stood on the crate because Preet told her to. Her cheeks burned until she felt fevered. She had crossed half a country to belong somewhere, and now the town looked at her as though belonging could be bid on by the yard. Opening obligation, Preet announced, $47.16. A ranch hand laughed. For a bride who won't speak. Another man called, "My be quiet is worth extra." The laughter rolled like dirty water. Adeline stared past them toward the church steeple. If she looked at faces, she would fall apart. If she looked at the banker's hand on her sleeve, she might run. But there was nowhere to run. The train was gone. Her money was gone. Daniel Whitcomb was in the ground before she had ever seen his face. Then the crowd changed. It was not silence exactly. It was the kind of stillness that came before a storm broke over open grass. A man on a dark bay horse had stopped at the edge of the street. He wore a black coat gray with trail dust, a Marshal star dulled by use, and a hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. He sat tall, not with pride, but with a hard habit of surviving. A rifle rested in a scabbard by his knee, and a revolver lay at his hip where every man could see it. "Preet," he said. The banker stiffened. "Marshal Hollis." "This is a civil matter." Lawrence Hollis swung down from the saddle. Spurs sounded once on packed dirt. He did not hurry. He did not raise his voice. Yet every step he took seemed to push the crowd backward. "I heard you were holding an auction," Lawrence said. "A lawful settlement. Livestock gets auctioned. Tools get auctioned. Land gets auctioned." His eyes moved to Adeline, and for one sharp second, she saw something colder than anger in him. Control. A man holding rage by the throat. "Women do not." Preet opened his ledger. "You have no authority over private debt." Lawrence took the ledger from his hand, closed it, and gave it back. "I have authority over public disorder, unlawful coercion, and any man who lays hands on a woman against her will in my street." She signed a contract. Did she sign to be sold on a crate? Preet's jaw moved. Lawrence turned toward Adeline. His voice changed. It did not soften much, but it lowered, as if he understood that loudness could be another kind of hand. "Miss Brennan, do you want to stand there?" Her fingers tightened around the slate. She shook her head, stepped down. Preet caught her elbow. Lawrence's revolver cleared leather before most men saw his hand move. The banker let go. Adeline stepped down from the crate. Her knees nearly failed. Lawrence did not touch her. He only stood between her and the town, broad-shouldered, silent, cold as winter iron. "This gathering is over," he said. No one argued. But as the crowd began to break apart, Adeline saw resentment settle in the banker's eyes like poison in a well. Silas Preet had not lost money that day. He had lost obedience. And men like him never forgave that. Lawrence Hollis did not know what to do with a rescued woman after the rescuing was done. He had stopped hangings, broken up knife fights, dragged drunk cowhands out of saloons, and once ridden 2 nights through sleet to bring back a stolen child. But Adeline Brennan stood beside his office door with a carpet bag in one hand and a slate in the other, and he found himself wishing for a simpler danger. Mercy Crossing watched from behind curtains. He could feel the town's hunger for scandal pressing against his back. A marshal who took an unmarried woman into his office would be talked about by sundown. A marshal who left her in the street would deserve the talking. Lawrence chose the lesser sin. "My office has a stove," he said. "You can sit a spell," she nodded. Inside, the jail smelled of wood smoke, leather, old coffee, and cold iron. 2 cells stood empty. A desk sat beneath a wall map, marked with cattle trails and county lines. Beside the stove was a chair with a woven seat. Lawrence set a kettle on the iron top and searched a cupboard for coffee, then remembered too late that coffee was poor comfort for a woman who looked as though she had swallowed a whole winter. He found a tin of peaches instead. Adeline took the bowl with both hands. She ate slowly, carefully, as if manners were the last shield she owned. Lawrence looked away to give her privacy. Her hands were thin. Her gloves had been mended twice. There was a bruise-colored weariness beneath her eyes. When she finished, she wrote on the slate and turned it toward him. "Thank you, Marshal Hollis." The neatness of her letters struck him. There was dignity in them. Pride, too, though battered. "Lawrence," he said before he could stop himself. "Folks call me Marshal. You can call me Lawrence if you've a mind." Her eyes lifted. They were gray-blue, not pale, not bright, but deep like a rain-filled creek. She erased the slate and wrote, "Thank you, Lawrence." His name looked strange in her hand. Gentle, almost. He cleared his throat. "Do you have kin?" She shook her head. "Money, another shay. Can you speak at all?" The question came out too blunt. He regretted it the instant her face closed. She looked down, and he saw her thumb rub over a faint scar at her wrist. After a moment, she wrote, "Sometimes, not when afraid." Lawrence read the words twice. Something in his chest tightened, old and unwelcome. He had known fear that stole voices. His younger sister, Clara, had stopped speaking for 3 days after raiders burned their father's outlying line shack when Lawrence was 22. She had been 13, hiding beneath a bed while smoke crawled under the door. He had pulled her out, alive but shaking, and promised no one would hurt her again. He had failed that promise 5 years later, when a bank man's greed and a crooked cattle deal sent her husband to ruin. Clara had died in childbirth in a cold cabin because the doctor would not ride without payment up front. Lawrence had buried his sister and her baby beneath a cottonwood, then put on a marshal's badge because it was easier to enforce law than forgive himself for arriving too late. He folded the memory away. "You need a place tonight," he said. Adeline wrote quickly, "I can sleep in the church. The church ladies will turn kindness into judgment before breakfast." She almost smiled, but it faded. "There's a widow west of town," Lawrence continued, "Mrs. Elspeth Vale. She takes washing, men's shirts, and minds 2 orphan boys. When their uncle Rye's herd, she has a spare cot. She's decent." Adeline hesitated. Then she wrote, "I cannot pay." "I can." Her head snapped up. She erased hard. No. The force of that one word on the slate almost made him smile despite himself. "All right," he said. "You can pay her in work if she agrees." Adeline nodded once. By late afternoon, Lawrence hitched his buckboard. Adeline climbed up beside him, careful not to let her shoulder brush his. Mercy Crossing watched them leave as if they were already guilty of something. Near the general store, Silas Preet stood beneath the awning with his thumbs in his vest. "That debt is not settled, Marshal," he called. Lawrence kept the reins loose. "File it proper. I intend to read it." The road west ran through sage and buffalo grass, past fence posts leaning like tired men. The sky opened wide beyond the town, washed clean by wind. Adeline held her carpetbag in her lap and looked at the land with cautious wonder. Lawrence wondered what she had expected. A husband, a home, a table, perhaps children. Instead, she had been handed a debt and a public shame. After a mile, she drew out her slate. "Why'd you stop him?" Lawrence did not answer right away. The bay horse flicked his ears. Harness leather creaked. Because he was wrong. She waited, as though she knew there was more. Lawrence kept his eyes on the road. "And because once I stood by too long while a banker called cruelty business." She did not ask for details. He was grateful. Mrs. Elspeth Vale's place sat in a hollow where cottonwoods bent over a creek. The house was small but clean, with quilts over the windows and smoke rising from a stone chimney. 2 boys, both red-haired and barefoot, stopped chasing a hoot when the buckboard rolled in. Elspeth came out wiping flour from her hands. She was a broad woman with silver hair pinned tight and eyes that had seen enough sorrow to recognize it without questions. "Lawrence Hollis," she said. "You look like trouble wearing a badge." "Likely." He climbed down. "This is Adeline Brennan. She needs shelter and work. She can sew and write. Maybe teach letters." Elspeth looked at Adeline, then at the carpetbag, then at the trembling effort with which the young woman stood straight. "Can she knead bread?" Adeline nodded. "Can she tolerate boys who think soap is a punishment?" A small, surprised breath escaped Adeline. Not quite a laugh, but close. Elspeth opened the door wider. "Then come in, child." Lawrence left before supper because staying would invite talk. But as he rode back toward Mercy, crossing in the purple dusk, he found himself looking once over his shoulder. Adeline stood in the doorway holding a lantern. The light framed her like something fragile but not broken. He told himself his duty was done. By morning, he knew it was not. Adeline woke before dawn to the sound of a rooster, creek water, and Elspeth Vale humming in the kitchen. For one confused moment, she thought she was back in the boarding house in Ohio, waiting for footsteps in the hall and the sharp voice of Mrs. Granger demanding rent. Then she smelled yeast and wood smoke and saw a quilt folded over her feet. She was still in Mercy Crossing, still unwanted by most, still indebted to a banker who had tried to sell her. But she was not on the crate. That was enough to make her rise. Elspeth did not coddle her, which Adeline came to understand as a form of respect. There was bread to shape, shirts to scrub, beans to sort, and 2 boys to keep from killing each other before breakfast. The older boy, Miles, was 9 and suspicious of everything. The younger, Toby, was 6 and missing 2 front teeth. They stared when Adeline wrote instead of spoke, then accepted her silence as children accept weather. By the second day, she had taught Toby to make an A with flour on the table. By the 4th, Miles pretended not to care while watching. By the 6th, both boys sat beside her after supper, copying letters onto scraps of brown wrapping paper, while Elspeth darned socks by lamplight. Lawrence came by every evening. At first he came with reasons: a sack of cornmeal Mrs. Vale had ordered, news that Pritt had filed a claim, a warning that Adeline should not walk into town alone. Then he came with less convincing reasons: a broken buckle needing mending, a question about whether the boys had seen a stray dun mare, a jar of horehound candy he claimed had been left at the jail by mistake. He never stayed long. He never crowded Adeline. He removed his hat when he entered, accepted coffee if Elspeth forced it into his hand, and spoke to the boys with the stern patience of a man who did not know how gentle he sounded. Adeline began to watch his hands. They were scarred, sun-browned, and careful. He set cups down quietly. He closed doors softly. When Toby fell asleep on the floor one evening, Lawrence lifted him as if the child were made of spun glass and carried him to the cot without waking him. A cold man, the town called him. Adeline saw coldness, yes, but not emptiness. His cold was like a water trough frozen over, something moving underneath where no one had taken the trouble to break the ice. Trust did not arrive as a confession. It came through work. Elspeth's roof leaked over the pantry after 2 nights of rain. Lawrence found Adeline outside with a bucket, trying to drag a ladder from the shed. The wind pulled at her hair. Mud swallowed the toes of her boots. "That ladder's cracked," he said. She pointed at the roof. "I see the leak." She pointed harder. His mouth twitched. "You ordering me, Miss Brennan?" For the first time, her eyes warmed with something like mischief. She picked up the slate from the porch rail. "Please." Lawrence fetched his own ladder from the barn, climbed to the roof, and began replacing split shingles while Adeline passed nails from below. Rain threatened in the west. Elspeth shouted advice from the kitchen window. The boys held boards that were too small to carry properly, and argued about who was helping more. Near dusk, Lawrence struck his thumb with the hammer. Adeline gasped. The sound was small, broken, but it was sound. He looked down. She looked away quickly, cheeks reddening, and held up a strip of clean cloth. When he climbed down, she took his hand before remembering herself. His skin was warm and rough. Blood welled beneath the nail. She cleaned it with boiled water and wrapped it with the seriousness of a nurse on a battlefield. "You've done this before," he said. She nodded. "For my father," she wrote. "He was a cooper, always cutting his hands." "Yes, he gone?" Her face softened with old grief. "Yes." "And your mother?" "Gone before him." He read the words and felt the shape of her aloneness. Not dramatic, not loud, just deep and plain. That evening, after the roof held through a hard rain, Elspeth made stew rich with onion and pepper. Lawrence stayed because the storm made leaving foolish. Thunder rolled far off, not near enough to frighten, only enough to deepen the warmth of the kitchen. Toby fell asleep against Adeline's sigh. Miles asked Lawrence if marshals ever shot men out of trees. Lawrence said, "Only fools climb trees during gunfights." Elspeth laughed until she coughed. Adeline sat with her hands around a mug, listening. The lamplight turned her hair chestnut. There was a looseness in her shoulders Lawrence had not seen before. Not happiness, perhaps, but rest. When the storm eased, he rose to go. At the door, Adeline followed him onto the porch. The air smelled of wet earth and cottonwood leaves. She held out the slate. "You do not have to keep saving me." Lawrence read it, then looked toward the dark road. "Maybe not." She waited. He turned back. "But I know what it costs when no one does." Adeline's fingers tightened around the slate. For a moment, she seemed to fight with herself. Then, barely above the rain dripping from the eaves, she whispered, "Thank you." The words were rough from disuse. They shook, but they were real. Lawrence felt them strike somewhere beneath his ribs. He nodded once, because if he said anything, his own voice might betray him. The next morning, Mercy Crossing had fresh gossip. By noon, Silas Pritt had fresh plans. The rumor reached Elspeth's house inside a basket of laundry. Mrs. Hattie Bell, who ran the boarding rooms over the Mercantile, brought 6 shirts, 2 pillowcases, and a mouthful of trouble. She set the basket down and said she did not believe a word of it, which meant she had repeated it 3 times already before breakfast. "They say Miss Brennan wasn't meant for Daniel Whitcomb at all," Hattie said. "They say she was sent here under false terms. They say Daniel tried to cancel the match once he learned." She could not speak, but she came anyway to claim his property. Adeline stood at the wash table with her hands in hot water. The soap slipped from her fingers. Elspeth's face hardened. "Who says?" Hattie's mouth folded. "Banker Pruitt has papers." Lawrence arrived an hour later to find Adeline pale, Elspeth furious, and the boys banished outside for learning words children should not know. He took the papers from Hattie, who had borrowed them long enough to be useful and sinful at once. The top sheet bore Daniel Whitcomb's signature. It claimed he had withdrawn his marriage offer 2 months before Adeline arrived. It claimed Adeline had been informed. It claimed any arrival after notice would be considered voluntary assumption of debt. Lawrence read it twice. The signature looked true, but the ink bothered him. Too dark, too fresh. Daniel had been dead 3 weeks. The papers smelled faintly of bank oil, not dust. Adeline watched his face and knew before he spoke that the lie was more dangerous than the auction. Shame in public could be survived. A written lie could become law. She reached for the slate. "I never received such notice." "I believe you," Lawrence said. The quickness of it brought tears to her eyes. Elspeth crossed her arms. "What can be done? I can ask questions Pritt won't like. Will that stop him?" Lawrence folded the paper. "Not yet." The deeper wound opened that afternoon. Lawrence rode to Daniel Whitcomb's old cabin, 3 miles north of town near a dry wash. The place had already been stripped. Bank tags hung from the door, the shed, even the chicken coop died. Inside, he found a bed frame, an overturned chair, and ashes in the stove. Most men would have seen nothing. Lawrence had spent years learning how greed tried to sweep its tracks. Beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, he found a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were Adeline's letters to Daniel, tied with blue thread. There was also one unfinished letter from Daniel to Adeline. "Miss Brennan," it began, "I have been told things I now believe are lies. Mr. Pruitt says your passage debt is greater than agreed, and he presses me to sign a note against my cabin. He says a silent wife will be a burden. I am ashamed I listen. If you still come, I will meet you as promised. No woman should be punished for another man's fear." The letter ended there. Lawrence held the paper a long time. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. He turned with his revolver drawn. A young man stood in the doorway, with both hands raised. He had straw-colored hair and a frightened face. Lawrence recognized him as Edwin Pike, Pruitt's junior clerk. "I didn't come to fight," Edwin said. "Then speak fast." Edwin swallowed. "Mr. Pruitt sent me to burn anything left." Lawrence's gaze sharpened. "I didn't know what he meant at first. I swear it. I thought it was old receipts. Then I saw her letters." He told Daniel the woman was feeble-minded, told him she had tricked men before. Daniel refused to sign more debt, and then he took sick, fever. Edwin looked at the floor. "Laudanum, in whiskey. I don't know if Mr. Pruitt meant to kill him. I don't." But Daniel signed something while he could barely hold a pen. After he died, Mr. Pruitt changed the dates. Lawrence stepped closer. "Can you prove that?" Edwin shook. "The real ledger is in the bank safe, not the one he shows. The black ledger. It has Daniel's note, the agency money, all of it. Mr. Pruitt has been buying desperate men's debts and taking land when they fall." Lawrence thought of his sister's cabin, his brother-in-law's ruined note, a doctor not paid, a grave under a cottonwood. "How long?" he asked. "Years." The word moved through Lawrence like a blade finding an old scar. When he returned to Elspeth's house near sundown, he found Adeline in the yard bringing sheets from the line. The prairie wind filled them like white sails. For a moment, she vanished behind one, then stepped out with cloth gathered to her chest. He told her only what he could prove. Daniel had not abandoned her. The cancellation was false. Pruitt had lied. Adeline sat on the porch step and covered her mouth with both hands. Tears came silently. Not many, just enough to wash something cruel from her face. "He waited for you," Lawrence said. Yes, best he could." She closed her eyes. The relief hurt almost as badly as the lie. Daniel had been real. His kindness had been real. Yet he was dead, and she was alive among strangers. And a banker had turned both their hopes into a trap. She wrote after a long while, "Why does Mr. Pruitt hate me?" Lawrence sat on the far end of the porch, leaving space between them. "I do not think he hates you. I think he wants what Daniel left, and what you represent threatens him." "What do I represent?" "A witness." He did not expect to have a soul. Adeline looked at him then. The wind moved loose strands of hair across her cheek. She reached for the slate, hesitated, and wrote, "What did he take from you?" Lawrence's jaw tightened. He could have stood. He could have told her it was not her concern. The old Lawrence would have. The Marshal, the cold man, the one who buried tenderness before anyone else could. Instead, he looked toward the creek. "My sister," he said, not by his hand alone, but by the kind of business he does. Her husband owed money on a cattle note. Pruitt called it due after a hard winter. Took the herd, took the house. Doctor refused to ride when she went into labor, because there was no cash left. I got there after. Adeline did not write. She simply sat with his grief. No advice, no pity sharpened into questions, only presence. Then she moved her hand slowly across the porch boards and set it near his, not touching, near enough that he could choose. After a long moment, Lawrence placed his wounded tomb, still wrapped in her cloth, lightly against her fingers. It was not a declaration. It was barely a touch, but for two lonely people who had been handled by life too harshly, it was a beginning. Inside the house, the clock ticked. Far away, the church bell rang 6. And in town, Silas Pruitt opened his safe, removed a black ledger, and began deciding whom he would destroy first. Pruitt struck where Lawrence could not ignore it. The next morning, a notice appeared on the jail door, the church door, and the mercantile window. It declared that Adeline Brennan was wanted for fraudulently entering a marriage contract, refusing lawful debt, and accepting shelter under false pretenses. It further stated that any citizen aiding her could be held responsible for her balance. By noon, Elspeth lost 2 laundry customers. By dusk, someone threw a stone through her kitchen window. Toby cried. Miles tried not to. Adeline swept the glass with hands that would not stop trembling. Elspeth cursed Pruitt so roughly, Lawrence had to pretend not to hear. "This ends," he said, but it did not end quickly. The county judge was 3 days' ride away. Pruitt owned half the town's debts and all its fear. Edwin Pike vanished before he could swear a statement. Some said he ran. Lawrence suspected worse. Adeline saw what her presence cost others. Elspeth's flour barrel lowered. The boys were mocked outside the schoolhouse. Lawrence found a dead snake nailed to the Marshal office door with a paper reading "Bride Thief." That night, Adeline packed her carpetbag. She did it quietly, folding the blue dress she had worn on the train, wrapping her father's Cooper knife in a handkerchief, placing Daniel's letters inside the lining. She had no plan beyond leaving before more harm came to those who had shown her mercy. At the door, Lawrence waited in the dark. "Running before breakfast is poor manners," he said. She froze. He stepped into the lantern light. His face was tired, unshaven, and hurt in a way he was trying not to show. Adeline gripped the carpetbag. He nodded toward the slate tucked under her arm. "Tell me why," she wrote with shaking chalk. "I will not let them suffer for me. Elspeth chooses for herself. The boys cannot." "No," he said. "But leaving won't save them from men like Pruitt. It will teach them that cruelty gets the house quiet." Her eyes flashed. She erased hard. "I am not your duty." "No." The word hung between them. Lawrence took off his hat, something he had never done outside at night. "You stop being just duty somewhere between a leaking roof and a boy learning his letters in flour." Adeline's breath caught. He looked away, as though the truth embarrassed him. "I am no good at soft words. I have been angry so long that peace feels like a trick. But I know this: if you leave because you choose a different life, I will hitch the team and drive you to the station myself. If you leave because Pruitt has frightened you into thinking your absence is a gift, I will stand in this doorway until sunrise." A tear slid down her cheek. She whispered, "I bring ruin." "No, men like Pruitt bring ruin. You brought bread to that kitchen, letters to those boys, a reason for an old widow to hum again." His voice roughened. "You brought my name back into my own mouth like it belonged to a man, and not just a badge." Adeline pressed her hand to her throat as if words hurt coming free. "I am afraid," she said. Lawrence took one careful step closer. "So am I." That surprised her more than courage would have. "I am afraid I will fail someone again," he said. "I am afraid I will draw too late, speak too late, love too late. I'm afraid that if I let myself want a home, the world will find a way to burn it." Adeline set down the carpetbag. The sacrifice came the following day. Lawrence rode to the bank at opening hour. Pruitt looked up from his desk with satisfaction already waiting in his face. "Come to settle the woman's account?" the banker asked. "Yeah." Pruitt leaned back. "On what terms?" Lawrence placed a folded deed on the desk. Pruitt's smile faded. It was the deed to Lawrence's small ranch north of the creek. 80 acres with a cabin, 2 wells, and grazing rights that had taken him 12 years to secure. It was the only thing he owned that was not issued by the county or carried on his body. "I will put up my land as bond against Adeline Brennan's alleged death," Lawrence said. "In return, you withdraw all public notices and agree to present your claim before Judge Harrow in open court." Pruitt touched the deed with greedy fingers. That land is worth far more than her balance. Then you should have no objection, and if the judge finds in my favor, you take the land. Pruitt studied him. For a woman who is not your wife. Lawrence's face did not move. For a woman you tried to sell. The banker's gaze sharpened. Careful, Marshal. No, you be careful. Open court means sworn ledgers, witnesses, dates, ink. Men who remember things after enough pressure is taken off their debts. Pruitt's fingers curled. He accepted the bond because greed could not refuse that. But he did not intend to let the matter reach court. That evening, Lawrence told Adeline what he had done. She stared at him as if he had struck himself on her behalf. No, she whispered. It buys time. You are home. Land is land. She shook her head fiercely. The voice that had once vanished beneath fear came out broken but strong. Do not make my freedom cost your home. He stepped closer, and this time he did take her hands. Adeline, that land has been a place I sleep. It has not been a home in years. She wept then, not because the sacrifice solved everything, but because it did not. Love, she was beginning to learn, was not a rescue that arrests danger. It was someone standing beside you while danger remained. 2 nights later, danger came on horseback. Lawrence was locking the jail when a gunshot cracked from the alley and shattered the lantern above his head. Darkness fell in hot oil and glass. A second shot grazed his shoulder and spun him against the door. He fired once at the muzzle flash, heard a curse, then boots running. Adeline, who had come into town with Elspeth to deliver mended shirts, saw him fall. She ran without thinking. Her voice broke open in the street. Lawrence. Every head turned. The silent bride had shouted the Marshal's name like a bell. He was bleeding, but alive. She pressed both hands to the wound while Elspeth tore cloth. Lawrence tried to sit up. Stay, Adeline ordered. Despite the pain, his mouth twitched. Yes, ma'am. Near the alley, Miles found something caught on a nail beside a broken barrel. A strip of brown coat cloth and a brass button stamped with the initials E.P. Edwin Pike. But Edwin had vanished. Lawrence's eyes darkened when he saw it. Either he shot me, he said, or Pruitt wants us thinking he did. Adeline looked toward the bank, its windows glowing gold, while the rest of the street stood in shadow. For the first time since she had arrived, she did not want to run from Mercy Crossing. She wanted the truth dragged into daylight. Judge Harrow arrived under a white-hot noon sun with 2 deputies, a traveling clerk, and a temper made worse by dust. By then, Mercy Crossing was swollen with rumor. Ranchers rode in from outlying spreads. Women filled the church steps. Men who owed Pruitt money stood at the back of the crowd, hats low, eyes restless. Everyone remembered the auction. Everyone remembered the Marshal stopping it. Now they had come to see whether law would protect the powerful or the shamed. Court was held in the church because it was the only building large enough. Adeline sat in the front pew beside Elspeth, hands folded tight in her lap. Lawrence stood near the aisle with his wounded arm bound beneath his coat. He looked pale but steady. When their eyes met, he did not smile. He simply nodded, and that was enough. Pruitt presented himself as a wrong businessman. He laid out contracts, debts, agency fees, and Daniel Whitcomb's supposed cancellation. He spoke of order. He spoke of moral duty. He spoke of dangerous women who pride on frontier loneliness. Adeline listened as if each word were a stone placed on her chest. Then Lawrence called for the bank ledgers. Pruitt smiled thinly. Destroyed in a recent office accident. A murmur moved through the church. Judge Harrow frowned. Convenient accidents irritate me, Mr. Pruitt. Before the banker could answer, the side door opened. Edwin Pike walked in with a bruised face, a split lip, and a black ledger clutched against his chest. 2 men moved as if to stop him. Lawrence's revolver was out before they took 3 steps. Sit down, he said. They sat. Edwin reached the front, trembling so hard the ledger shook. He looked at Pruitt, then at Adeline. "I am sorry, Miss Brennan," he said. His testimony came in pieces, but pieces can build a gallows. He told how Pruitt inflated passage costs, how Daniel refused to sign away his cabin after realizing Adeline had been lied about, how laudanum had been mixed into Daniel's whiskey during his fever, how the cancellation letter had been dated after the fact, how desperate men's debts had been turned into land seizures for years. Then Lawrence placed Daniel's unfinished letter before the judge. Adeline was asked to confirm her letters. She rose, every eye turned toward her. The church that had watched her shame now waited for her voice. For a moment, fear closed its old hand around her throat. Lawrence did not move toward her. He did not rescue her from this. Some doors had to be opened from the inside. Adeline looked at the letter Daniel had begun. She thought of the train platform, the crate, the laughter, Elspeth's kitchen, Toby's flour-covered A, Lawrence's hand resting beside hers on the porch. She lifted her chin. "My name is Adeline Brennan," she said, the words uneven but clear. "I came to Mercy Crossing because I was promised marriage, work, and a chance to belong. I did not come to steal. I did not come to deceive. I was left alone because Mr. Pruitt lied to a dying man and then tried to make my shame profitable." Silence filled the church. Then one woman began to cry. Judge Harrow took the ledger. He read long enough for Pruitt's face to lose color. By sundown, the banker was under arrest for fraud, coercion, and suspected involvement in Daniel Whitcomb's death. His accounts were seized. His claims were suspended. Men who had feared him for years stood straighter as the deputies led him down the church aisle. At the door, Pruitt twisted back toward Adeline. "You think this makes you clean?" Lawrence stepped between them, but Adeline touched his arm. She faced the banker herself. "No," she said softly. "I was never dirty." Those 5 words did what no revolver could. They ended his power over her. But the story was not finished. A week later, the town held another auction in the same livery yard. This time the crate was gone. In its place stood tables covered with bank-seized goods being returned, sold fairly, or used to repay those Pruitt had cheated. Judge Harrow oversaw the proceedings. The preacher offered an apology so awkward and sincere that Elspeth forgave him halfway through and scolded him for the other half. Adeline stood beside Lawrence beneath the livery sign. The air smelled of horses, dust, fresh bread from the hotel kitchen, and rain waiting somewhere beyond the hills. No one laughed at her now. Some still looked ashamed. Some came forward to speak kindly. She accepted what she could and let the rest pass. Daniel Whitcomb's cabin was restored to his estate, and because no kin could be found, Judge Harrow ruled that the agency debt had been false and the remaining property could be sold for the school fund Daniel had once hoped to support. Adeline asked that his letters be buried with him. Lawrence rode with her to the cemetery, and together they placed them beneath a small stone that finally bore his full name. "You loved him?" Lawrence asked quietly as they stood in the grass. Adeline thought about it. "I loved the hope he gave me," she said, "and I grieve the honest man he tried to be." Lawrence nodded. He understood loving the dead without belonging to them forever. His own land bond was released. Yet, when he returned to his ranch, it felt different. The cabin was still plain. The porch still sagged on one corner. The well ropes still needed replacing. But Adeline walked through the doorway carrying a basket of curtains she had sewn from flour sacks, and suddenly the empty room seemed to hold their breath. Elspeth and the boys came often. Toby learned to read from a primer Adeline wrote by hand. Miles pretended not to enjoy lessons until Lawrence caught him sounding out wanted posters at the jail. The town asked Adeline to teach 3 mornings a week in the church hall. The first day, she stood before 12 children with chalk in her hand, voice trembling but present, and wrote her name on the board. Adeline Brennan. Not silent, not sold, not ashamed. Autumn came gold across the prairie. Lawrence mended the porch. Adeline planted Rosemary by the door and hung Daniel's blue thread around a page in her Bible, not as a chain to the past, but as a marker of survival. In the evenings they sat outside while the sky turned rose and copper, speaking sometimes, sitting quiet other times. Silence between them no longer meant fear. It meant rest. The proposal came without spectacle. Lawrence found her in the kitchen after rain, kneading dough with sleeves rolled to her elbows and flour on her cheek. He stood in the doorway so long she looked up. "What is it?" she asked. He held his hat in both hands. "I've been trying to make this sound fine." Her eyes softened. And it keeps coming out true instead." She wiped her hands on her apron. Lawrence stepped into the warm kitchen. "Adeline Brennan, I do not want to own your rescue. I do not want your gratitude mistaken for love. I do not want you choosing me because I stood between you and a cruel crowd." She listened, eyes bright. "I want you free," he said. "Free to teach, free to leave, free to stay. And if staying ever becomes what your heart wants, I would be honored to spend my life making a home where no one can put a price on your dignity again." Adeline crossed the room and took his hands, scarred fingers and all. "I choose to stay," she said, "not because you stopped the auction. Because afterward you let me stand." He closed his eyes for one breath, as if those words relieved a pain he had carried too long. They were married in the church at Christmas, with snow along the fence rails and lanterns glowing in every window. Elspeth cried openly. The boys wore boots too large for them and carried rings with grave importance. Lawrence spoke his vows steadily, until Adeline said his name, and then his voice broke just enough for half the town to pretend not to notice. Afterward, the church bell rang across Mercy Crossing, clear and strong in the cold air. Months later, when spring grass silvered the hills, a stranger riding through town asked about the story. He had heard a banker once tried to sell a mail-order bride. An old rancher pointed toward the schoolhouse yard. There, beneath the bright morning sun, Adeline Hollis stood on the very boards that had once formed the auction crate. Lawrence had cut them down, planned them smooth, and built a reading bench for the children. Adeline sat among them with a book open on her lap, her voice carrying over dust, horses, and prairie wind. Lawrence leaned against the fence nearby, Marshal's star catching the light, no longer cold in the way Mercy Crossing had once known him. The title's cruel image had returned, but love had changed its meaning. What had been a platform of shame had become a place of learning. What had been a crowd's judgment had become children gathered close. What had been a silent bride sold by a banker had become a woman reading aloud in her own clear voice, while the cowboy Marshal, who stopped the auction, watched over the home they had built together.